All right, good evening. I appreciate the courage that you've displayed by showing up tonight for Daniel chapter 11. Let me just start by saying that you can take notes if you can, but there's so much detail and so much historical detail in the verses that we're going to look at tonight that you can pick up things along the way as you can, but I would suggest that you just sort of hang on for the ride. All right? David Jeremiah has a commentary on the book of Daniel, and I have used it a little bit in this series, but he tells a story. When it comes to this chapter, he tells a story that I think is appropriate. He tells a story about a professor at a liberal theological seminary who was teaching his class about the book of Daniel. That class, like most seminary classes, was composed of young men and women, many of them who would be future leaders in churches. In the beginning of his letter, he said, I want you to understand that Daniel was written during the Maccabean period in the 2nd century BC, not by the historic Daniel who lived in the 6th century BC. The facts were written, as all history is, after the events took place. Now, before I tell you the rest of the story, you need to understand that Daniel is one of the most criticized books among liberal theologians for that very reason. Most prophecy in the Bible is filled with symbols and pictures of things that are specific to a degree, but not specific like a multiple choice exam in a history class. Daniel, on the other hand, is specific down to the tiniest details. And because most people in progressive Christianity approach God's Word as just a historical collection of documents, they have to come to the place where they say, because the prophecy passages in Daniel feel different than the other prophets in the Bible, and because they're so extraordinarily precise, that it must have been written by somebody using Daniel, but someone who wrote following the events that are prophesied. We're going to start with the assumption that Jesus knew what he was saying when he mentioned that Daniel was the author of the book of Daniel. That's where the rest of this story goes that David Jeremiah shares. The professor said this book was written in the 2nd century, not in the 6th century. And he said, one young man raised his hand and asked, how can that be, sir, when Christ said in Matthew 24:16 that it was written by Daniel? The professor paused a moment, looked the student in the eyes, and said, young man, I know more about the book of Daniel than Jesus did. The problem is, there are seminaries across America filled with professors like that, producing students who are standing in pulpits teaching what they learned in seminary. I'm going to not only present this material as history in advance, but I'm going to explain to you why Daniel is so much more precise than the rest of prophecy given in the Old Testament. Okay? So let's go to Daniel chapter 11. I have reneged. I have backed out. I'm a coward. Not a coward, but I have just accepted the reality that we're not going to get through 45 verses tonight. We're going to do 35 verses. That leaves 10 verses in this chapter. There are 13 verses in chapter 12. Chapter 12 is a continuation of this vision. Remember, Daniel was praying for 21 days, and the messenger came, dispatched with the answer to his prayer, and and chapter 10 is sort of all the preliminaries. And now in chapter 11, the angel is ready to give the vision for which he was dispatched. And it continues all the way through the end of the book. So I'm going to do, essentially, this is the way I'm going to divide it up. Verses 1 through 35 are things that were future to Daniel, but they are past to us. Then from verse 36 through the end of the book, next week we're going to look at the rest of the vision, and these are things that were future for Daniel and still remain future for us. Okay? It's like a Netflix show that always ends on a cliffhanger, so you have to come back the next week. The outline that I've given you, I've called this one of the most remarkable predictive sections in the entire Bible. Remember, the reason Daniel is praying, the reason this vision was given is because he's aware not only that the 70 years of exile have come to a conclusion, but he knows that there are at least 2 rounds of refugees that have returned to Jerusalem. But the news from Jerusalem is not good. And so here is Daniel, and we, you have to be so careful looking at Old Testament scripture, because it's easy for us to go, he just should have had more faith. I mean, that's easy to say looking back. Daniel knows that the exile is over. He knows that the people are being returned, at least those willing to go. But I think he must have had an idea that the beautiful land, as he called it, that the beautiful city, as he refers to Jerusalem, that the people were going to just get back into the promised land, and they were going to have the grandeur that was Jerusalem before the Babylonian destruction. And yet all the news that he has is it's not going well. And so he has this 21-day period of fasting and prayer. He calls it mourning. And God says, all right, I'm going to give you an explanation, an extraordinary explanation. And you sort of need to put on your big boy pants, because I want you to understand this, but these are weighty things for you to handle. The entire vision is future to Daniel. But we're going to look at the parts that have already historically unfolded, and I want you to see just how amazingly exact they are. And then I'll explain to you, as I said, why I believe this prophecy is like that. The first part, I've called this Persians and Greeks. Chapter 11, verse 1. In the first year of Darius, remember the end of chapter 10 is the angel saying, okay, now I'm here, we've got all the preliminaries out of the way, I'm going to give you the vision that I've been dispatched to give you. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be of assistance and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will stir up the entire empire against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, because his sovereignty will be removed and given to others besides them. Persians and Greeks. This is the part of chapter 11 that we have seen more than once in previous visions. This is the part where the Babylonians are defeated by the Medes and the Persians. There's a series of kings that God uses to end the exile, to send the Jews back to the Holy Land. And then Persia is confronted by the up-and-coming Greek Empire. And I want you to see the precision here, okay? There are 3 more kings going to arise in Persia, then a 4th will gain more riches than all of them. Cyrus was the king that began the return of the exiles to Babylon. Cyrus ruled the Persian Empire from 539 to 529 BC. He was followed by his son Cambyses, who ruled 529 to 522. Now, there's an interesting little historical note here that is, I think, not included in this text because it's just a historical oddity. There was a man, he ruled for about 6 months after Cambyses, and the reason was this man apparently bore a remarkable physical likeness to Cambyses. He's called Pseudo-Smerdis. Pseudo meaning fake. His name was Smerdis. He ruled after the death of Cambyses as Cambyses for about 6 months before everybody figured out it wasn't the real king. He doesn't really count. It's just sort of a historical trivia. You have Cyrus, you have Cambyses, and then you have a king that shows up in the account of God's chosen people, Darius. Darius ruled from 521 to 486 BC, about 35 years, a pretty significant reign over the empire of Persia. Following Darius, he says here is a fourth king who will gain far more riches than all of them before. The fourth king in the line reigned from 486 to 465. You may have heard of his name. His name is Xerxes. Now, we know Xerxes because that's the name used as the war between the Persians and the Greeks began to unfold. Xerxes was determined to expand the Persian Empire at the expense of the young and up-and-coming Greek Empire. He has another name in the Bible. His other name is Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus shows up in the book of Esther. Xerxes and Ahasuerus are the same kings. Ahasuerus is the king that makes Esther a queen in the book of Esther. Now, in Esther, we have Xerxes was extraordinarily wealthy. The Persian Empire reached its peak under Xerxes. It had the largest army. It had the widest boundaries. It had the most wealth under this king, more than any of those that went before, just as the prophecy said. Xerxes or Ahasuerus, we're told in the first chapter of Esther, typical of his excesses, we're told in that book that he threw a feast for his guests that lasted 180 days. I mean, imagine a 6-month party. That was typical, in a sense, of the kind of excess that was this man. It says in verse 2, he will stir up the entire empire against the realm of Greece. Historically, that's exactly what happened. He set his sights on expanding Persia, and Greece was the target. Verse 3, a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Again, we've seen this part of the story unfold in previous visions. This was the warrior king that we know as Alexander the Great. Now, Xerxes was in 486 to 465, about a 20-year reign, but he did so much damage to Greece, even though he never fully conquered it. He had to withdraw. If you know the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, this is the king. This is the Persian king that came to destroy Greece and sort of went home with his tail between his legs. But he did enough damage to Greece that the Greeks hated the Persians. For 100 years, they hated the Persians. Xerxes left the throne at 465 BC. 120 years later, in 336 BC, we have the rise of Alexander the Great. There's more than a century between verse 2 and verse 3 in this prophecy. In fact, verses 1 through 4, those introductory 4 verses cover about 200 years of time. So Alexander is the king. Verse 3, he rules with great authority, and he does as he pleases. He conquered Persia. He created an empire that by territory was the greatest empire in human history. I mean, Alexander is the ruler that they used to say he marched his armies off the map. The known maps that they had of what would have been considered the civilized world, there was still land at the edge of the map, so he just kept going. It was a remarkable thing, and what was even more remarkable is he did it all by the time he was in his early 30s. At the age of 32 or 33, he dies unexpectedly. Verse 4, as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants. Remember what happened when Alexander died? His kingdom was divided between his 4 primary generals. 2 of them sort of went off and they have history, but they've kind of faded from the pages of biblical history. The 2 that have most significance for us are the line of the Ptolemies. The general named Ptolemy took the Egyptian or North African portion of the empire, and then Syria. The Syria, or what we have here under the title the King of the North, the Syrian Empire, that portion of the Greek Empire, went to a general named Seleucid, and his line are called the Seleucids. So we've got these 4 verses. This empire is broken up in 4 directions. Not to his own descendants, not according to his authority which he wielded, because his sovereignty will be removed and given to others. Okay, those 4 verses are Persia and Greece, and they are precise. The number of kings, there are other kings, obviously, between Xerxes and 100 years later when Alexander comes to power, but it was Xerxes, the 4th king, the king of wealth, the king of the most massive army. That's where the damage was done to Greece, which created the grudge that 100 years later Alexander decides to make right. Okay, the other kings are sort of historical footnotes. Now, verses 5 through 20, I've entitled this Egyptians and Syrians, because we're going to look at the prophecy is going to take us through the interactions between those 2 generals and their line of kings that came. Now, they're going to be referred to as the king of the south and the king of the north. The reason we have this prophecy is if you look in the map in the back of your Bible, what you see is that Egypt is the king of the south. North Africa, they are south of the beautiful land. They are south of Israel. North of Israel is Syria, a capital centered in Damascus. Because these 2 lines of kings have this perpetual struggle to sort of defeat the opponent and expand their territory, poor Israel, they are the pathway between these 2 battling kingdoms. Until we get much later into the Maccabean period, which is in the 2nd century, for a couple of 100 years, Israel didn't do anything. They're just minding their business, and you've got the Syrian army marching south, you've got the Egyptian army marching north, and it is a perpetual, nonstop battlefield in the land of Israel. Now, here's where I want you to begin to see. You have the Egyptian division, the king under the Ptolemies, the kings of the south, the Syrian division under the Seleucids, the kings of the north. Now, here's where this is going to just be really stunning. All right, I'm just going to do this a couple of verses at a time so that I can just kind of capture for you the history here. Verse 5, then the king of the south, remember this is the Egyptian kingdom, Egypt south, Syria north, okay? Keep that in mind. You say, well, why didn't they just use Egypt and Syria? Because this all happened before it was after Daniel's time, Okay? For Daniel, he didn't need to know the names of nations and lines of kings. The point for Daniel was Israel's caught in the middle. And that's where this story is going to find its drama. The king of the south will grow strong along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and rule. His domain will be a great realm indeed, and after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to reach an agreement, but she will not keep her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who fathered her, as well as he who supported her in those times. All right. If you don't know the history, you read that verse and you go, I got nothing. I don't know what that means. Okay, let me walk you through it. The king of the south, in verse 5, is a king by the name of Ptolemy Soter, the king from 304 to 283 BC. He was the original general who received a portion of Alexander's empire and made himself a king. The general over the Syrian kingdom in the north was called Seleucus Nicator, 304 to 281. He was the general that received the Syrian division and became a line of kings in the north. In verse 6, it speaks about the daughter of the king of the south who made an agreement with the king of the north but did not retain her power. All right, here's what happened. The daughter of Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, was a woman by the name of Berenice. Berenice was actually she was the granddaughter of Ptolemy Soter. She was the daughter of that Ptolemy's son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. This is going to get, I don't want to overdo the history, but I want you to capture the precision of this, okay? This is the general who became a king. His granddaughter was, in effect, married off to the king of the north, which was a normal way in the ancient world to create a peace treaty, an alliance. You gave a daughter in marriage. Now, the kings of Syria, you know about Antiochus Epiphanes. We're going to get to him. But Antiochus was not a name, it was a title. So all of these kings of Syria have Antiochus in their name. Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy, was given to a king named Antiochus Theos. You know the word theos? It means God. Antiochus the god. Just a little ambitious. Here's the thing. Antiochus was the grandson of the original King Seleucus in the same way that Berenice was the granddaughter of the original Ptolemy. The problem is that Antiochus Theos was married. So in order to secure the peace treaty with the kings between the kings of the north and the south, Antiochus divorced his wife and put her aside with their son. He marries Berenice to secure the treaty. Now notice how this verse says, after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to reach an agreement. Okay, there's the treaty. But she will not keep her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in and the one who fathered her, as well as he who supported her in those times. Here's what the verse means. Berenice comes, she secures the treaty by marrying Antiochus Theos, and then within 3 years of the marriage, the union ends because Berenice is murdered. Ooh. Now, Antiochus Theos, somebody that has the word God in his name, you think would be smarter than this. When Berenice died, he went and found his first wife and brought her back. Married her and put her back on the throne. Only for her to assassinate him and place her once disowned son, Seleucus Callinicus, on the throne. Okay, see, this is what I meant. You don't want to take notes of this, but I want to tell you these stories, okay? So verse 7, we have an attempted peace treaty. It falls through because the daughter that comes to be given in marriage, she's murdered. Now the king that accepted her has been murdered, and his disowned son is now on the throne. So Egypt and Syria are once again at odds with each other. Why? Because the king of Egypt, his daughter was killed. She was assassinated, and then the king that he tried to make the agreement with was assassinated. So now we have odds between them again. All right, verse 7. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and prevail. And he will also take into captivity to Egypt their gods with their cast metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. All right, here's the history. It says that a branch of her roots, the daughter that has been assassinated, a branch with her roots will come to power in Egypt. He will then defeat the disowned son that sits on the throne of the Syrian Empire. The branch that it refers to here is Berenice's brother. His name was Ptolemy Euergetes. He marched north out of Egypt and attacked Syria, severely defeating Seleucus Callinicus and murdering the jealous wife that had assassinated her husband and put her son on the throne. There is not a great life expectancy for royalty in the ancient world. As verse 8 says, he carried away booty he plundered the Syrian Empire and carried all of that wealth in great quantity back to Egypt. And then in verse 9, it says, in retaliation, Callinicus, having been defeated and losing all that wealth that was carried back to Egypt, he regathers his forces. Look at verse 9. Then the latter, meaning the king of Syria, will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. Sure enough, history tells us that Callinicus regathered his forces and attempted a retaliatory attack against Egypt in 240 BC, but was unsuccessful, didn't win the battle, and had to return, as verse 9 says, to his own land. All right, there will be a test at the end of this lesson. Let's keep going. Verse 10. And his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, so that he may again wage war up to his fortress. And the king of the south will be enraged and go out to fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be handed over to the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be haughty, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. All right, here's the history. Callinicus had two sons. One was called Cyrannus, and the other was called Antiochus the Great. Now, this is important because Antiochus the Great is eventually going to be the father of Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, the one name that you should recognize in this whole historical drama. Cyrannus and Antiochus the Great are said to have jointly assembled great forces. But before they could use their forces against Egypt, the elder Cyrannus was killed in a minor skirmish in Asia Minor. That left the younger brother, Antiochus the Great, to press the battle against Egypt. And it says in verse 10 that he shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. It is Hebrew language that paints a picture of a decisive victory, like water that can't be stopped. It flooded over Egypt. That's the description of the conquest. And sure enough, historically, that's precisely what happens. He drove the Egyptians back from their position at the north of Palestine. Now think about this. We have Syria in the north. We have Egypt in the south. Nothing's been said about Israel yet. But we have these battles back and forth. Well, every time somebody invades the other one, they travel over Israel. Well, with the last Egyptian conquest, they established the Egyptian border at the northern border of Israel, which was with the border of Syria. So in this battle, Antiochus the Great pushes into Egypt, and he drives them not only out of Israel, but all the way back, and he sweeps across Egypt in a decisive victory. Now, historically, we know that this happened in a couple of campaigns, but he pushed as far as a city in the south of Israel called Raphia, which is probably what is meant by the fortress that we're going to see mentioned here. He fights. So this battle goes on. Okay. When the king of the south, that's Egypt, moves in retaliation. See, now it's time for Egypt to retaliate against Antiochus the Great. This king was named Philopator. He was one of the Ptolemies. He was the son of the brother of Berenice, her nephew. He's now the Ptolemy in charge of the Egyptian empire. He was just defeated by Antiochus, but it says in the text that he retaliates with great strength and pushes the Syrians out of Egypt. Where? Back into Israel. The Hebrew text is a little uncertain here, but when it says in verse 13, "For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment," it seems to fit this moment when the Egyptians are battling the Syrian army under Antiochus. The king of the north, Egypt retaliates. Now the king of the north raises a greater multitude. You kind of get the feel of the back and forth. I mean, this is a battle that happens in waves over a couple of hundred years. And every time there's a king, they're determined to right the wrongs, and whoever won the last round, armies are built up, resources are drafted together, and the battle is engaged yet again. The text says that the king of the north, the Ptolemies, the king of the south is the Ptolemies. It says that when verse 14, "Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south, the violent ones among your people." Okay, this is the first hint. Who's the angel talking to? Daniel. Who is your people? This is the first time that Israel or Judah has come into the story. They've been unfortunate bystanders to this constant back and forth. They've basically been the battlefield. It says in verse 14, "Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south," that is Egypt. "The violent ones among your people will also raise themselves up to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, pile up an assault ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. And he will set his mind on coming with the power of his entire kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, But a commander will put a stop to his taunting against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his taunting. So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and not be found. Then in his place one will arise who will allow an oppressor to pass through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger nor in battle. Okay. This chapter is literally impossible to understand without overlaying the historical record. Okay? Let me just try and outline briefly the explanation of what's happening here. It says here that Ptolemy would become incredibly proud, the king of Egypt, which was in keeping with his character. This Ptolemy, Philopator, was disliked by his own people. He was haughty. He was a profligate person. But it says he was able to inflict terrible slaughter on the Syrian forces, but he was not strengthened himself. See, what happened was, it says that he will, let's see. Verse 16, this is talking about the Egyptian king. He will come against him, the northern king, and do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. But he will stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. What happened is, this Ptolemy pressed Antiochus the Great out of Egypt and essentially out of Israel and back into Syria. But instead of pressing his advantage and trying to bring a final defeat to the Syrian Empire, because he was a profligate, because he was a lover of luxury, he stayed for a time in Israel and then withdrew to his own palace to just live the life that he thought a king deserved to live. What he did was he left his enemy unconquered, defeated but unconquered. And because the constant threat against Egypt was not dealt with, it's interesting. It says he stays for a time. He will set his mind on coming with the power of his entire kingdom, bringing a proposal of peace. He was incredibly unpopular with his own people because he didn't solve the problem. It's like being invaded time and time again by an enemy and then seeming to have the upper hand, and the king going, that's enough. I'm tired of fighting. Let's go home and have a banquet. In verse 13, Antiochus comes back to Egypt. And there is by this time a king in Egypt by the name of Epiphanes. Now, this is not Antiochus Epiphanes. This is Ptolemy Epiphanes. You remember, Epiphanes means the glorious or the illustrious. He took that title. But here's the problem. Because his father was so unpopular, he is assassinated, and his son, Epiphanes, is put on the throne. The problem is, Epiphanes is 4 years old when he's made king. In verse 14, it says, many will rise up against the king of the south, that is Epiphanes, yes, the 4-year-old. Many will rise up against him, including the violent ones among your people. In other words, seeing the hope of ending this, with a 4-year-old king on the throne in Egypt, there are now Jews who are tired of being bystanders in this back and forth battle. They throw in their lot with the king of the Syrians in an attempt to defeat Egypt, thinking, if somebody will finally win, maybe they'll leave us alone. So there are violent ones among Daniel's people. It really is a reference to apostate Jews who have agreed to aid the pagan king of Syria and fight against Egypt. Hopefully, they're hoping, I think, to get Egypt out of Israel and hoping that Syria will go home and just leave them alone. In verse 17, it describes, it says he will set his mind on coming with the power of his entire kingdom. This is Antiochus's attempt to take over Egypt with the strength of his whole kingdom. He has gambled everything on this final assault, and he's going to try and overwhelm Egypt. But for some reason, and this is a historical mystery, for some reason, he decides that he can't probably pull this off. So he resorts to a strategy that we've already seen before. He brings a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. And to secure the peace, he gives the daughter of women to secure it. In fact, he gives his daughter to Ptolemy Epiphanes, and hopes by that marriage to secure peace. But here's the deception part. We know from history that the plan, because, and there was about a 4-year delay or 5-year delay in here, because by the time he makes the proposal of marriage, the 4-year-old king is now a 10-year-old king, but they have to wait about 4 years before he's old enough to actually take a wife. But see, the daughter that's given in marriage to now this 14-year-old king, here's the plan. I'm going to give you in marriage, and we're going to secure a peace treaty. But daughter, just between you and me, it's a fake. It's a trick. And you're going to insinuate yourself into the household of King Ptolemy Epiphanes. And at the right time, you're going to be my source of information. And see, what he's done is he's decided he can't sweep into Egypt in straight conquest, so he's going to use treachery. He gives his daughter, but it's not a good faith gesture. He means to give her as a spy so that she can work with her father to bring about the downfall of Egypt. He expected his daughter to cooperate with him, but look at the end of verse 17. He will set his mind on coming with the power of his entire kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it. But she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Guess what happens? She actually falls in love with Ptolemy. And she rejects her father's plan and betrays her father, and she won't be the mole in the Egyptian royal house to bring about their defeat. Why is this historically important? It's not. Except to show you the precision of this prophecy. It's right down to even the motives and the actions of specific individuals. Verse 18. This is Antiochus again, Antiochus the Great. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his taunting against him. Okay, here's what happens. Antiochus has been frustrated by the betrayal of his daughter. He can't succeed by extending his influence across Egypt, so he decides to turn his attention to Macedonia, a third part of the 4-kingdom division of Alexander's territory. He goes toward the Aegean Isles and decides to take Greece. But look at what happens here. But a commander will put a stop to his taunting. Historically, here's what happened. Rome is a republic. It is beginning to rise on the horizon as a major player in world events. It's not yet the Roman Empire, it's the Roman Republic. But just as Antiochus the Great has turned his attention away from Egypt and towards Greece, which is in the other direction, and he's going to expand his empire in that way, thinking that he has less opposition in that direction, he gets a notice from the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate shows up and with an order that he abandon his movement into Greece. See, Greece, if Greece is conquered, it brings the Syrian Empire's borders much closer to the Roman Republic. They send a famous general named Lucius Scipio Asiaticus against Antiochus, and Antiochus is defeated to the point that he not only has to go home, but he has to give Rome part of his territory. I mean, he cannot catch a break. He can't defeat Egypt. He can't get to Greece. And now he has run afoul of Rome, and they have made him pay with territory. Verse 19, so he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and not be found. In other words, he returns home a defeated and humbled king, only to very soon, within a year of his defeat by Rome, he dies in 187 BC. His grand plans, both for Egypt and for the Aegean Isles and Greece, are spectacular failures. In verse 20, then in his place one will arise who will allow an oppressor to pass through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger nor in battle. That verse, verse 20, speaks about Seleucus Philopator, who was his successor. The kingdom that he received from his father was still pretty sizable in territory, but now it's completely bankrupt. I mean, nothing will burn through your treasury like military defeat. Not only did they lose to Egypt, not only did they fail in Greece, not only did they lose to Rome, but Rome took land and then assessed a huge debt that they assigned to Syria as reparations. And so it says here, in his place one will arise who will allow an oppressor to pass through the jewel of his kingdom. That word oppressor, if you look in the notes at the bottom of your page, you'll probably see that another translation for that Hebrew word is tax collector. What happened is, to try and balance the budget, he sends a tax collector, you guessed it, into Israel. And he shakes them down. For your protection, you have to pay for us to protect you from Egypt. And the tax collector is a prime minister who serves under the king. His name is Heliodorus. Heliodorus is mentioned in 2nd Maccabees as a man who not only swept across Palestine, plundering towns and villages, but made it all the way to Jerusalem where he plundered the temple treasury. It says that Seleucus, the king, would be destroyed neither in anger nor in battle. In other words, he died by assassination almost certainly at the hands of his tax collector. Why did I do this? I did this to make this point. While without the historical understanding, which Daniel obviously didn't have, it's hard to follow the telling of the story. But when you take historical facts and you lay it as a template on top of this chapter, what you see is, from the movements of south to north and from north to south, the progression of kings, the intrigues of deception and treachery, I mean down to individuals. This story is precisely what would happen over the next hundreds of years. All right, let's go on. It just keeps getting better. Look at verse 21. And in his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the majesty of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Okay, that's a great verse. There is a king that will follow the death of Antiochus the Great. It will be his son. It will be another of his sons. Remember I said Antiochus the Great is the one who fended off the Syrian army. Antiochus the Great dies, And he has an older son who is granted the throne, but he gets sideways in some other battles. He gets sideways with Rome and finds himself temporarily imprisoned in Rome. Antiochus Epiphanes, look at the detail of this verse. One will arise who will allow an oppressor to, no, that was verse 21. In his place, a despicable person will arise on whom the majesty of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Antiochus Epiphanes was not the rightful heir, but Big Brother is in jail in Rome, and so without the right for the throne to be conferred upon him, he just seizes the opportunity and takes the throne. This is Prince John while Richard the Lionheart is still gone on crusades. That's what's happening here. Antiochus seizes the moment. His brother is out of the mix, and he asserts himself. Now, in verses 21 through 35, and we don't have to go through this in great detail because here's the thing. 21 through 35 is detail about Antiochus. You say, well, why, with all these other kings, they just get a verse here and a verse here, and we move on to the next king, and we have this whole hundreds of years portrayed, and then all of a sudden, Antiochus Epiphanes gets verses 21 through 35. Let me read them, and then I'll explain what's going on here. Verse 21, he will come in a time of tranquility, seize the kingdom by intrigue. And the overflowing forces will be flooded away from him and smashed, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers did not, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, spoils, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. All right, let me do this a little bit at a time. Antiochus takes the throne. It's not his, but he takes it, and there's nobody there to challenge him. At this point, Syria is in a bad way. I mean, they continue to be bankrupt. The vast majority of this kingdom, for economic reasons, they are now a poor kingdom. A lot of territory, but not much wealth. Antiochus does what politicians love to do. I mean, even though the numbers don't make sense, what do we do in our culture? Everybody wants to tax the rich. You know, we're gonna go get we're gonna soak the 1%. Well, the 1%, if you took every penny they owned, couldn't support everything. I mean, the math doesn't work. But politicians have always played that class warfare game, and here Antiochus goes into his own cities and towns and plunders the remaining wealthy people in the kingdom, and then, like Robin Hood, he hands out the wealth to the poor people. Well, what's he doing? He's securing the loyalty of the underclasses. He gives them free stuff. They are on his page. A time-honored political tradition. Favors bring support. That's what happens. It says he entered the richest parts of his realm, things his fathers, even his ancestors, never did. He plundered his own people, but that happens for a time. Verse 25. And he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south, that is Egypt, with a large army, so the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. But he will not stand because schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed because the end is still to come at the appointed time. All right, here's what happens. All of this giving and taking of daughters to try and create peace treaties, an interesting thing happens. By the time we get to Antiochus Epiphanes, he does what every king before him does, and he sets his sights on Egypt. The solution is all of our wealth is down in Egypt. We got to go conquer Egypt. He assembles a massive army, and sets his sights on Egypt. But here's the kicker. At this point, the king of Egypt, the Ptolemy in Egypt, is Antiochus Epiphanes' nephew. So he sets out to invade Egypt, but without going into any more detail than I already have, treachery and betrayal everywhere. Everybody's lying to everybody else. Everybody's cheating. Everybody's betraying loyalties. Everybody's a double agent. And Antiochus, even though he has this massive army, he can't pull off the conquest. He goes to Egypt, but he can't win. It says, verse 26, those who eat his choice food will destroy him. His army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. In other words, he's betrayed by people who eat at the king's table. These are high-ranking double agents. They betray him, and even though he has this massive army, even though using that same language of a flood, even though he floods across Egypt, he loses so many troops that he can't consolidate the gains. In other words, he can win a battle, but then he doesn't have enough troops left to establish control over a territory. So as he wins a battle, he has to withdraw to consolidate, and he loses all the ground that he just won in a battle. Verse 27. So he decides to try the other way. You can't beat them, you join them. So the two kings, uncle and nephew, sit down, and they have negotiations to come up with a peace treaty. Verse 27. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed because the end is still to come at the appointed time. They come up with a peace treaty, which neither one of them intends to keep. It's all a charade. It's all meant to they're both trying to gain time and advantage so that they can take out the other. You say, why is this in the Bible? This is the normal flow of non-biblical history in the ancient world. This is normal. This is the way kingdoms rise and fall in the ancient world. Assassination, intrigue, invasion, betrayal. This is the way the world worked. What's fascinating is this is history in advance with such precision that we can only know by looking back how exact the detail is of this whole story. All right, real quickly, verse 28. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. Okay, here, set against the holy covenant. Here's another reference to Israel. What's happened here? Remember when we talked in an earlier vision about Antiochus and his absolute determination to destroy the Jews? You're like, okay, other than just assigning that to satanic motivation, what was this about? Well, he has just been humbled. Antiochus the glorious, Antiochus the illustrious. He has just been humbled. He's won battles, but he couldn't secure the land. So in effect, he's lost the war. He's not successful in the negotiations that he was trying to gain an upper hand. So essentially, he marches back through Israel and pitches a temper tantrum. He just has a scorched earth policy. He's going to destroy everything in his path on the way back. He's going to pick Israel clean like a hyena chewing on a dead carcass. And he sets himself up. He can't, when people can't have the glory and the service that they think they're owed, they will do whatever they have to do to get it. This king saw himself as the greatest king in a line of great kings, when the reality was he was a two-bit nobody. And so he set himself up in the temple of Jerusalem and said, all right, as of today, I'm your God, and you will worship me. All right, let's see where the story goes. Verse 29, at the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but the last time it will not turn out the way it did before, for ships of Kedem, that's Rome, will come against him. Therefore he will withdraw in fear and will return and curse the holy covenant and take action. Defeated in Egypt, he plunders Israel. Now he comes back, but he runs into the Romans who are expanding their territory. And he's now defeated by the Romans, and this time is when he lands in Israel. And this is what we have in First Maccabees with the abomination of desolation, with sacrificing a swine in the temple in Jerusalem, setting up a statue of Zeus and demanding that the Greek gods be honored. That's all happening. This is about 169 BC. It says he will curse the Holy Covenant and take action. So he will come back and pay attention to those who abandon the Holy Covenant. Okay, what happens? There are Jews that decide that God has abandoned them. They've been the subject of constant warfare for hundreds of years. Worshiping God obviously isn't doing them any good in their minds. And so there are those who side with Antiochus. They nuzzle up next to him and they say, yeah, we're there. Antiochus actually appoints a Greek-speaking high priest who agrees. He gets the job because he agrees to promote the Greek gods in the temple to fit this agenda that Antiochus is trying to implement. That's what this verse means when it talks about those who desecrate the sanctuary fortress and do away with the regular sacrifice. There were Jews that willingly went along with Antiochus to try and gain some advantage in this horrible invasion situation. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary forces, and do away with the regular sacrifice. They will set up the abomination of desolation, that's the sacrifice of the swine in the temple, and by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will be strong and take action. Who's that? That's the Maccabees. That's the Jewish revolt that begins this civil war to drive Antiochus Epiphanes and the Syrian army out of Israel. Verse 33, those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. And some of those who have insight will fall to refine, purge, and to cleanse them until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Okay, in those verses, we have reference to what we've talked about in previous visions, the entire 2nd century BC, where we have the Maccabees leading a revolt. It says some people will join them insincerely. They had Jews that went back and forth depending on who they thought had the best odds on any given day of winning. But the Maccabees were successful to the degree that eventually Antiochus is driven out of Israel, and for a brief period of time, from 167 or about 163 BC until the Romans sweep in some decades later, there's a brief window where Israel has the glory of their independence. For the first time in centuries, they are again a standalone nation. And eventually Rome comes in, they become an occupying force, and then we move into the New Testament. Okay? Now, why this kind of almost oppressive detail? Because here's the thing. While everything in chapter 11 and in chapter 12 are future events to Daniel, the closing part of chapter 11 and all of chapter 12 are about not just the end of that season of the Jewish history. It's about the end of human history. Why the precise prophecies? I mean, more specific probably than any other section of prophecies in the Bible. Here's the reason. Because we're going to see 13 and 10, we're going to see 23 verses about what is still to come. The temptation would be to look at that and go, well, maybe it's symbol. There's some numbers that we're going to see next week. Maybe it's generalities. Here's the thing. When we interpret the closing section of Daniel, we have to interpret it historically and literally, because God shows us what the part of history that we've already seen in this story. The prophecy is not symbolic. It's not generalized. It's not sort of a big picture sweep. It is specific down to individuals who have motives and actions. Why all of this precision? So that we can look back and see the precision of the prophecy, and we can look forward, and we can know that the rest of the prophecy is just as precise. Well, how do we know that the prophecy shifts from the period of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids ending with Antiochus Epiphanes? How do we know that it shifts from Antiochus, who is a model, a little a Antichrist? How do we know that it shifts to the end of human history to the capital A Antichrist? Well, we'll see this next week, but in a real quick summary, we know this way. Because at verse 36, we still have the language of the king of the south and the king of the north. But one thing becomes immediately clear, and that is the language of king of the south and king of the north can no longer accurately fit the Egyptian and Syrian armies that we've seen in the earlier verses. Similar, exactly the same language, king of the south, king of the north, but the character of the people involved, the character of the ruler that is in these closing verses, it doesn't fit Antiochus. The historical events no longer can be assigned to specific evidence that we have. There's something that happens between verse 35 and verse 36, and we jump from what we saw in an earlier vision. We essentially jump from almost the end of Daniel's 69th week. We skip over a gap of centuries, and we get to Daniel's 70th week, and we see the picture that Antiochus Epiphanes paints for us. We now see in all of its fullness and horror the Antichrist. I've been able to give you all the detail leading up. We're going to get a little fuzzier going forward, because what remains is still ahead of us. But we will interpret it as best we can and as literally as we can, because this prophecy is presented to us as actual history unfolding before our eyes. There's no reason to shift our interpretation into symbolism and other kinds of interpretation. We're going to follow this same pattern all the way through, only now we're not looking back. We're looking forward, and we're going to see how the book of Daniel ends next week. Okay? Father, thank you for this. Your word is captivating, it is fascinating, and even when it is difficult, what we find when we apply ourselves under the leadership of your Spirit is that your word is absolutely true in every last detail. Father, I pray that you would strengthen us with confidence, because we've seen what is behind us and how precise your word is. We have confidence that what is ahead of us is just as precise, that you are not surprised by anything that will unfold, Lord, that gives us confidence to live in these days. Thank you for that. We pray tonight in Jesus' name. Amen.